The moment Clara Whitmore stepped into the lanternlit clearing where the harvest festival was in full swing, she knew every eye in Sweetwater, Wyoming, would be watching her, waiting to see if the widow would finally break under the weight of their whispers. It was October of 1881, and the autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and roasting corn, fiddles playing a lively tune that made her chest ache with a loneliness so profound she could taste it like copper on her tongue. She had come alone, as she did everything now, 6 months after they had buried Thomas in the hard ground behind the church, 6 months of existing in a fog of grief that made her feel like she was watching her own life from somewhere far away. The other women had stopped inviting her to their quilting circles, stopped bringing casseroles to her door, and she understood why, because grief made people uncomfortable, made them remember their own mortality, their own fragile hold on happiness. Clara moved through the crowd like a ghost, nodding politely when old Mrs. Henderson touched her arm with a pitying expression that made her want to scream. She was 24 years old, far too young to be wrapped in black crepe and treated like something broken beyond repair. Thomas had been a good man, a steady man who worked at the mercantile and never raised his voice. But if she was being honest with herself in the dark hours of the night, she had married him more out of practicality than passion. Her father had died when she was 19, leaving her and her mother with nothing, and Thomas had offered security, respectability, a future that did not involve becoming a burden on distant relatives. She had cared for him, had tried to be a good wife, but there had never been fire between them, never been the kind of love that the dime novels whispered about in their melodramatic pages. The music swelled and changed, becoming something slower, more melancholy, and Clara found herself drifting to the edge of the makeshift dance floor where couples swayed together under strings of lanterns that glowed like captured stars. She watched them with an emotion she could not quite name, something between envy and resignation, and before she quite realized what she was doing, she had moved into an empty space at the far corner of the clearing. The music seemed to reach inside her chest and pull something loose, something that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. She began to dance alone, her eyes closed, her arms moving through the air as though she were partnered with a phantom, and for the first time in 6 months, she felt something other than the crushing weight of obligation and sorrow. She did not know how long she danced like that, lost in the music and the flickering shadows, but when she finally opened her eyes, she found herself staring into the face of a man she had never seen before. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were the color of aged whiskey, warm and steady, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. He was not looking at her with pity or discomfort, or any of the expressions she had grown accustomed to seeing on the faces of the people in Sweetwater. He was looking at her like she was the most fascinating thing he had ever encountered, like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve, a story he wanted to hear. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot, and he extended his hand toward her in a gesture that was both question and invitation. "I'd be honored if you'd let me be your partner for this dance, and every other one tonight if you're willing." Clara stared at his outstretched hand, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that left her dizzy. Every instinct told her to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of her grief and isolation, to protect herself from the vulnerability that came with connection. But there was something about this stranger, something about the way he stood there with his hand extended and no judgment in his eyes, that made her want to be brave. She thought about the dance she had just performed alone, about the feeling of the music moving through her body like water, about how alive she had felt for those few precious moments. She thought about Thomas, who had been kind but never understood the restless spirit that lived inside her, who had wanted her to be content with a small, safe life when she had always dreamed of something more. She placed her hand in his, and the warmth of his calloused palm against hers sent a jolt of electricity up her arm that made her gasp. He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his entire face, and he drew her into the proper position for dancing with a gentleness that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. They began to move together, and Clara was startled by how perfectly they fit, how easily he led and she followed, as though they had been dancing together for years instead of seconds. He held her at a respectable distance, but there was an intimacy in the way their eyes met and held, in the way his hand pressed against the small of her back, in the way her fingers rested on his shoulder. "I'm James," he said as they turned in a slow circle, the fiddles playing something sweet and achingly beautiful. "James Callahan. I work at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles east of here. I know it's forward of me to approach you like this, but I saw you dancing alone, and I thought to myself that no woman should ever have to dance alone, not when there's music playing and stars overhead." "Clara," she managed, her voice coming out barely above a whisper. "Clara Whitmore." She saw recognition flicker in his eyes, saw him make the connection between her name and her black dress, and she braced herself for the inevitable change in his expression, the way warmth would be replaced by awkward sympathy. But it never came. Instead, James just nodded slightly, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected, and he continued to guide her through the dance with the same steady confidence. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Clara," he said, and the way he spoke her name made something flutter in her chest like a trapped bird seeking freedom. "I hope you don't mind me saying so, but you're a beautiful dancer. Watching you move just now, it was like seeing something wild and free, like a hawk riding the wind currents." No one had ever spoken to her like that before, with such poetic observation, such genuine appreciation for something beyond her appearance or her domestic capabilities. Thomas had complimented her cooking, her needlework, the way she kept their small house tidy. But he had never noticed the way she moved, the way music affected her, the parts of her that existed beyond her role as his wife. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously, not wanting to make a spectacle of herself in front of this stranger who was quickly becoming something more than a stranger with every step they took together. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now. "I haven't danced in a very long time. I wasn't sure I remembered how." "Your body remembered," James said, and there was no flirtation in his tone, just simple honesty. "Some things live in our bones, in our blood. Music is like that. Movement is like that. Joy is like that, even when we think we've forgotten it completely." The song ended, and Clara expected him to release her, to bow politely and return to wherever he had come from, but instead he kept her hand in his as the next song began. It was faster this time, a reel that had other couples laughing and spinning with abandon, and James raised an eyebrow in question. Clara felt a smile tug at her lips, the first genuine smile she had felt in longer than she could remember, and she nodded. They launched into the dance, and she found herself laughing as he spun her and caught her, as they wove between other couples and moved with a synchronicity that felt almost magical. She was aware of people watching them, aware of whispers starting to spread through the crowd like wildfire, but for once she did not care. She had spent 6 months being the proper widow, being the object of pity and concern, being small and quiet and acceptable. For this one night, she wanted to be herself, wanted to feel alive, wanted to remember what it was like to exist as something other than a symbol of loss. James seemed to understand this without her having to explain, seemed to sense exactly what she needed, and he gave it to her with every dance, every smile, every moment of his undivided attention. They danced through 5 more songs, and Clara felt something shifting inside her chest, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. Between dances, James would fetch her cups of apple cider, would stand close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, would tell her stories about the ranch where he worked and the horses he trained. He had come to Wyoming 2 years ago from Texas, he explained, looking for a fresh start after his own share of hardship. His father had died in a range war, his mother had passed from fever shortly after, and he had decided that staying in a place filled with ghosts was no way to live. "I understand a little of what you're going through," he said quietly as they stood at the edge of the clearing, watching other couples dance. "Not exactly, because everyone's grief is their own. But I know what it's like to feel like you're carrying something so heavy you're not sure you can take another step. I know what it's like to feel like you're supposed to be something you're not, like you're supposed to fit yourself into a shape that doesn't match who you actually are." Clara turned to look at him, really look at him, and she saw the shadows in his eyes that matched her own. There was a depth to James Callahan that she had not expected, a thoughtfulness that went beyond his weather-beaten appearance and cowboy drawl. He was 28, he had told her, old enough to have seen hardship but young enough to still believe in the possibility of happiness. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, wanted to know everything about him, but the music was starting again and he was extending his hand once more. One more dance. He asked, and Clara realized with a start that the evening was winding down, that the harvest festival was drawing to a close, and soon everyone would be heading home to their warm beds and ordinary lives. "One more," she agreed, even though her feet ached and her cheeks hurt from smiling. This last dance was slow, intimate, and James held her closer than he had before, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and something uniquely him. They moved together in silence, and Clara rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady thump of his heartbeat beneath her ear. She felt safe in a way she had not felt in years, perhaps ever, and she understood with a clarity that was almost frightening that this man had changed something fundamental in her in the space of a few hours. When the music finally ended and the last notes faded into the night air, James did not immediately release her. They stood there together, swaying slightly even though there was no longer any music to guide them, and Clara felt his hand come up to cup her cheek with a tenderness that made her want to weep. "Can I see you again?" he asked, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I know it's probably too soon, I know people will talk, but Clara, I have to see you again. I've been half alive for 2 years, just going through the motions, and tonight when I saw you dancing, when I held you in my arms, I felt something wake up inside me that I thought was dead and buried." Clara knew she should say no, knew she should be sensible and proper and concerned about her reputation. She had only been widowed for 6 months, and society dictated that she should mourn for at least a year before even considering the company of another man. But society had not held her through the long, dark nights when she had cried herself to sleep from loneliness. Society had not made her feel alive and seen and valued. Society had not danced with her under the stars like she was something precious and rare. "Yes," she whispered, her hand coming up to cover his where it still rested against her face. "Yes, I want to see you again." The relief that flooded James's expression was so profound it made her chest ache. He smiled that slow, transformative smile again, and he leaned down to press a chaste kiss to her forehead, a promise of things to come. "I'll call on you tomorrow afternoon if that's all right," he said. "We could take a walk, maybe. I'd like to get to know you properly, Clara Whitmore, not just as a dancing partner but as a person." "I'd like that too," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They walked together to the edge of the clearing where Clara's small wagon was waiting, the old mare she had inherited from Thomas standing patiently in the traces. James helped her up onto the seat with his hands on her waist, and the simple touch sent heat flooding through her body in a way that should have embarrassed her, but instead felt like coming home. He stood there looking up at her, his hand resting on the side of the wagon, and she had to resist the urge to lean down and kiss him properly, to taste his lips and see if they felt as perfect as she imagined. "Tomorrow," he said, and it was both confirmation and promise. "Tomorrow," she echoed, and she picked up the reins and guided her mare out onto the dark road that led back to town. The ride home seemed to take no time at all, her mind replaying every moment of the evening like a precious memory she was desperate to preserve. She thought about the way James had looked at her, the way he had moved with her, the way he had spoken to her like she was an equal rather than a fragile thing to be managed and pitied. She thought about how his hand had felt in hers, warm and strong and sure, and she felt a flutter of anticipation low in her belly that was entirely new and entirely wonderful. When she reached her small house on the outskirts of Sweetwater, she unhitched the mare and led her into the tiny stable behind the property, making sure she had fresh water and hay before heading inside. The house felt different somehow, less like a tomb and more like a space with possibility. She lit a lamp and moved through the familiar rooms, seeing them with new eyes. The black crepe she had hung over the mirror in the parlor suddenly seemed excessive, morbid even, and she found herself pulling it down and folding it carefully. She looked at her reflection in the lamplight, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her with flushed cheeks and bright eyes. She prepared for bed slowly, brushing out her long auburn hair and changing into her nightgown, and when she finally climbed between the cool sheets, she found that sleep was impossible. Her mind was too full of James, of the way he had made her feel, of the possibilities that had opened up before her like a door to a room she had never known existed. She thought about his eyes, warm and understanding, and she thought about his voice, rough and gentle all at once. She thought about the way he had called her beautiful, not in a practiced or obligatory way, but with genuine wonder, as though he truly saw something in her worth admiring. Dawn came too slowly and too quickly all at once, and Clara rose with an energy she had not felt in months. She went about her morning chores with unusual vigor, feeding the chickens and gathering eggs, tending to her small vegetable garden that had gone somewhat neglected during her period of deepest grief. She swept the floors and dusted the furniture, and then she stood in front of her wardrobe for a long time, trying to decide what to wear. Everything she owned was black or gray, mourning clothes that seemed to suck the life from her complexion. Finally, she pulled out a dress that had been Thomas's favorite, a simple gray cotton with small black buttons, and she decided that it would have to do. She was nervous as the afternoon approached, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. What if James had changed his mind? What if the magic of last night had been nothing more than lantern light and music, and in the harsh light of day, he would see her for what she really was, a widow with nothing to offer but a modest house and a handful of chickens? She tried to push these thoughts away, but they persisted like thorns under her skin, making her jump at every sound, convinced each one was the approach of his horse. When he finally did arrive, riding a beautiful chestnut gelding and leading a second horse by the reins, Clara felt her breath catch in her throat all over again. He looked even better in daylight, his features sharper and more defined, his eyes somehow warmer. He dismounted with easy grace and approached her door, hat in hand, and when she opened it before he could knock, his face lit up with such obvious pleasure that all her doubts evaporated like morning mist. "Clara," he said, and again that flutter in her chest at the way he spoke her name. "I brought a horse for you if you'd like to ride instead of walk. I thought maybe we could go out to Willow Creek, have a picnic by the water. I packed some food from the ranch kitchen." Clara had not been on a horse since before Thomas died. He had never approved of women riding astride, had thought it unladylike, and she had given up one more small piece of herself to keep the peace. But looking at James now, at the beautiful gray mare he had brought for her, she felt that same reckless desire for freedom that had made her dance alone at the festival. "I'd love to," she said, and she fetched a shawl from inside before following him to where the horses waited. James helped her mount, his hands steady on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle, and Clara arranged her skirts as modestly as she could before taking up the reins. The mare was gentle and responsive, and as they set off down the road together, Clara felt another piece of her old self returning. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, leaving the town behind and heading out into the open country where the grass grew tall and golden, and the sky seemed to stretch on forever. Willow Creek was about 3 miles from town, a beautiful spot where cottonwood trees grew thick along the banks, and the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. James had been there before, he explained as they dismounted, and he had thought it would be the perfect place for them to talk without the prying eyes of Sweetwater watching their every move. He spread a blanket on a flat spot near the water's edge, and he unpacked the food he had brought: fresh bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of cold tea. They sat together on the blanket, and for a while they just ate and enjoyed the peaceful surroundings. Clara felt more relaxed than she had in longer than she could remember, more herself. Eventually, James started asking her questions about her life, and she found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. She talked about growing up on a small farm outside of Denver, about how her father had taught her to love reading and learning despite having very little formal education himself. She talked about how he had died when a plow horse had kicked him in the chest, how her mother had faded away within a year from what the doctor called a broken heart, but what Clara suspected was simply the inability to imagine a future without the man she loved. "I married Thomas because I was alone and scared," she admitted, pulling up blades of grass and letting them fall through her fingers. "He was kind and he offered me stability, and I convinced myself that was enough. But it wasn't passion, James. It wasn't the kind of love that makes you feel alive. Does that make me a terrible person?" James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the creek where sunlight danced across the water's surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and free of judgment. "I think it makes you human," he said. "I think it makes you someone who did what she had to do to survive in a world that doesn't make survival easy for women on their own. You gave Thomas companionship and care, and he gave you security. There's no shame in that, Clara. The shame would be in staying trapped in grief for a life that never quite fit you right, in refusing to reach for something more when it's standing right in front of you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and she saw the same longing in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. Without quite meaning to, she reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and the simple touch felt more intimate than anything she had ever experienced with Thomas in 3 years of marriage. "Tell me about Texas," she said softly. "Tell me about your life before you came here." James told her about growing up on a ranch near San Antonio, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the endless blue skies and the way the heat shimmered off the ground in summer. He told her about his father, a stubborn man who had refused to back down when a larger rancher had tried to force him off his land, and how that stubbornness had gotten him killed in a gunfight that never should have happened. He told her about his mother, a quiet woman who had loved her husband so completely that losing him had destroyed something fundamental in her, and how James had watched helplessly as she had simply stopped eating, stopped caring, until fever had taken her as well. "I understand what you said about your marriage," he admitted, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Because I had the opposite. I watched my parents and I saw what real love looked like, the kind that burns so bright it consumes everything around it. And I told myself I'd never settle for anything less, even if it meant being alone for the rest of my life. But the problem with that kind of love is that it's rare, Clara. Most people never find it. And I was starting to think maybe I never would either, that maybe I'd used up all my chances, and what I saw between my parents was something that only happens once in a lifetime. Then I saw you dancing." Clara's throat felt tight with emotion, and she had to blink back tears. "What did you see when you watched me dance?" "I saw someone who was alive," James said simply. "I saw someone who felt things deeply, who had music in her soul, who refused to be crushed by circumstance even when circumstance was doing its damnedest to break her. I saw the kind of woman I could love, Clara, the kind of woman I could spend my life with and never once be bored or disappointed or wish I was somewhere else." The words hung between them like something physical, something tangible, and Clara felt her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. It was too soon, she knew that. They barely knew each other. But sometimes knowing came in an instant, in a look, in the way two people fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting their whole lives to be complete. "I could love you too," she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating. "I think maybe I already do." James made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She clung to him just as fiercely, her face pressed against his shoulder, breathing in his scent and feeling his heart hammering against hers. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other, and when they finally pulled apart enough to look at each other, Clara saw her own feelings reflected back at her in his whiskey-colored eyes. He kissed her then, slowly and carefully, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to. But she did not want to. She kissed him back with a hunger that surprised her, with a passion she had not known she was capable of feeling. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she felt like she had been set on fire from the inside out. "Clara Whitmore," James said, his forehead resting against hers, "I know this is fast, I know people will say we're being reckless, but I don't care. I've wasted enough of my life being careful, being practical. I want to be with you. I want to court you properly, and then when enough time has passed that it won't cause too much scandal, I want to marry you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build a life with you, a real life full of joy and passion and all the things that make existence worth the struggle." "Yes," Clara said, because there was no other answer that made sense, no other path that felt right. Yes to all of it, yes to everything. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the creek, talking and kissing and making plans for a future that felt suddenly, miraculously possible. James told her about the small house on the Double R Ranch where he lived, about the plans he had to eventually save enough money to buy his own land and start his own herd. Clara told him about her dreams of having children, of creating a family built on love rather than obligation, of maybe starting a small school in Sweetwater where children could learn to read and write and think for themselves. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they reluctantly packed up their picnic and prepared to ride back to town. James helped Clara mount her horse, and this time when his hands lingered on her waist, when he looked up at her with undisguised longing, she leaned down and kissed him again, not caring if anyone happened to ride by and see them. The ride back to Sweetwater was leisurely, both of them reluctant to end their time together. When they reached Clara's house, James dismounted and helped her down, and they stood together in the gathering dusk, hands clasped, neither wanting to be the first to let go. "Can I see you again tomorrow?" James asked, and Clara laughed at the eagerness in his voice. "I think you're going to have to," she said. "I don't think I could bear a whole day without seeing you. Then I'll come by in the morning," he promised. "We could go riding again or just sit on your porch and talk. I don't care what we do as long as I'm with you." He kissed her one more time, long and sweet, and then he forced himself to step back and mount his horse. Clara stood in her doorway and watched him ride away into the twilight, her hand pressed against her lips where she could still feel the warmth of his kiss. She went inside feeling like she was floating, like her feet were not quite touching the ground, and she moved through her evening routine in a daze of happiness. That night, when she climbed into bed, she did not feel the crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long. Instead, she felt hope, bright and warm and full of promise. She fell asleep thinking about James, about his smile and his voice and the way he had held her like she was something infinitely precious, and her dreams were sweet and full of possibility. The next morning, James arrived even earlier than expected, riding up just as Clara was finishing her breakfast. She invited him in, and he sat at her small kitchen table while she made coffee, and the domesticity of the moment felt both thrilling and entirely natural. They spent the morning talking, and Clara learned more about his work at the Double R, about the horses he was training and the foreman who had taken him under his wing when he first arrived in Wyoming. Over the next several weeks, James became a constant presence in Clara's life. He came by every day, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, and they would go for rides or walks or simply sit together on her porch and watch the world go by. The people of Sweetwater noticed, of course, and the whispers that had started at the harvest festival grew louder and more insistent. Clara's few remaining friends expressed concern about her reputation, about how quickly she seemed to be moving on from her late husband's death. The minister stopped by one afternoon to gently remind her of the proper mourning period and the importance of respectability. Clara listened politely to all of them, but she did not change her behavior. She had spent too many years living according to other people's expectations, and she was done with that. James made her happy in a way nothing else ever had, and she was not going to give that up just because some old biddies in town thought it was improper. Let them talk, she decided. Let them clutch their pearls and gossip over their tea. She had found something real and rare, and she was going to hold on to it with both hands. James faced his own challenges at the ranch. Some of the other cowboys teased him about being so obviously smitten, and the foreman, a gruff older man named Bill Henderson, took him aside one evening to ask about his intentions regarding the widow Whitmore. "She's a good woman," Bill said, his expression serious. "And she's been through enough without some cowboy breaking her heart because he was thinking with something other than his brain." "I'm going to marry her," James said without hesitation. "I know it's fast, I know it looks bad, but I love her, Bill. I've never felt anything like this before, and I'm not going to let her go." Bill studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then, just make sure you treat her right. A woman like that, who's been through what she's been through, she deserves someone who's going to stand by her no matter what." "I will," James promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. As autumn deepened into early winter, James and Clara's relationship continued to grow and strengthen. They were careful not to be too openly affectionate in town, not wanting to cause more scandal than necessary. But when they were alone together, they could not keep their hands off each other. They kissed until their lips were swollen, held each other until their arms ached, talked until their voices were hoarse. Clara had never known that love could feel like this, like coming home and going on an adventure all at the same time. One evening in late November, James arrived at Clara's house with a serious expression that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. They sat together on her small sofa, and he took both of her hands in his thumbs stroking across her knuckles in a gesture that was meant to be comforting but only increased her nervousness. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about our future, about where we go from here. I know we've only been courting for a couple of months, and I know that's not long enough by society's standards. But Clara, I can't wait anymore. I don't want to wait anymore. I love you, and I want to spend my life with you, and I don't see how more time is going to change that." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "What are you saying, James?" He slid off the sofa and onto one knee, and Clara felt tears spring to her eyes before he even said the words. He pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, and he looked up at her with such love and hope that she thought her heart might burst. "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? Will you let me be your husband, your partner, your best friend for as long as we both shall live? I know I don't have much to offer you right now, just a small house on someone else's land and a cowboy's wages. But I promise I'll work every day for the rest of my life to give you the kind of life you deserve. I promise I'll love you and cherish you and never take for granted the gift of your presence in my life. So what do you say, Clara? Will you marry me?" "Yes," Clara said through her tears, and she slid off the sofa and into his arms, kissing him with all the love and passion she felt. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." James slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made just for her. They held each other on the floor of her small parlor, laughing and crying at the same time, dizzy with happiness and the enormity of the commitment they had just made to each other. "When?" Clara asked when they had calmed down enough to think practically. "When should we get married?" "As soon as possible," James said firmly. "I don't want to wait months for some big wedding that neither of us cares about. Let's do it simply, just us and whoever we need as witnesses. What do you think about right after Christmas?" "That would give us time to make the necessary arrangements, but wouldn't require us to wait forever." Clara thought about it, thought about the gossip it would cause, thought about the minister's disapproval and the whispers that would follow them everywhere. And then she thought about waking up next to James every morning, about building a life with him, about finally getting to experience the kind of love she had always dreamed of, but never thought she would find. "Right after Christmas sounds perfect," she said, and she kissed him again because she could not help herself. They told Bill Henderson first, the next day at the ranch. The foreman looked surprised but not displeased, and after a moment of consideration, he shook James's hand warmly and wished them both happiness. The news spread quickly after that, and within days, all of Sweetwater knew that the widow Whitmore was engaged to that cowboy from the Double R Ranch. The reactions were mixed, with some people genuinely happy for Clara and others scandalized by the speed of the courtship. Clara's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a kind older woman who had lost her own husband years earlier, stopped by one afternoon with a basket of preserves and some friendly advice. "Don't let them make you feel guilty," she said as they sat together over tea. "I know what it's like to be a widow in a small town, to have everyone watching and judging your every move. But Clara, life is too short to spend it being miserable just to satisfy other people's sense of propriety. If you've found love again, if you've found someone who makes you happy, then hold on to that with both hands and don't let go. The gossips will find something else to talk about soon enough." Clara hugged her gratefully, touched by the support from an unexpected quarter. She wished she had more friends like Mrs. Patterson, people who understood that life was complicated and messy and did not always fit into neat boxes of acceptable behavior. The weeks leading up to Christmas were a flurry of activity. Clara had very little money, but she wanted to make their wedding day special nonetheless. She took apart one of her old dresses, a soft blue cotton that she had worn before Thomas died, and she carefully refashioned it into something more suitable for a wedding. She was a skilled seamstress, and she worked late into the night by lamplight, her fingers flying over the fabric as she created something beautiful from something that had nearly been forgotten. James spent his evenings with her whenever he could, and they made plans for their future together. He had spoken with Bill Henderson about the possibility of them living in his small house on the ranch, and Bill had agreed without hesitation. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a small kitchen, but it would be theirs, and that was all that mattered. James promised that he would work hard and save money, and that someday they would have their own land, their own home, something they had built together from the ground up. Christmas arrived, cold and clear, with fresh snow blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Clara attended services at the church, feeling the weight of disapproving stares from some of the congregation, but also seeing genuine smiles from others. After the service, the minister approached her with a resignation in his expression that suggested he had already fought this battle with himself and lost. "I understand you wish to be married after the new year," he said stiffly. "I must say I have reservations about the propriety of such a hasty union, but Mrs. Patterson has spoken quite persuasively on your behalf, and I have decided that denying you the sanctity of marriage would be a greater sin than sanctioning what some might consider an imprudent match." "Will the 28th of December suit you?" Clara felt relief flood through her, warm and sweet. "Yes, Reverend, thank you, that would be perfect." She went directly from the church to the Double R Ranch, where James was waiting for her with barely contained excitement. When she told him the news, he picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure joy. Bill Henderson had given James the day off, and several of the other cowboys had offered to help move Clara's few possessions from her house in town to the ranch before the wedding. The 28th of December dawned crisp and cold, with a pale winter sun climbing slowly into a sky the color of faded denim. Clara woke in her small house for the last time as Clara Whitmore, and she felt a mixture of nervousness and exhilaration that made her hands shake as she prepared for the day ahead. She bathed carefully in cold water heated on the stove, then dressed in the blue gown she had made, arranging her auburn hair in a simple but elegant style. She had no jewelry except for the ring James had given her, but she did not need anything else. She felt beautiful, and more importantly, she felt happy. Mrs. Patterson arrived mid-morning to help her with final preparations, and together they walked to the church where James was waiting. He was dressed in his Sunday best, his dark hair neatly combed, his face shining with such love and anticipation that Clara felt her eyes fill with tears the moment she saw him. Bill Henderson was there to serve as his witness, and Mrs. Patterson stood with Clara, and the small ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When the minister asked if James would take Clara to be his lawfully wedded wife, his "I do" rang out strong and clear, echoing in the small church. When it was Clara's turn, she spoke her vow with equal certainty, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. They exchanged simple bands, James having purchased a matching ring for himself with money he had saved from his wages. And when the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. They emerged from the church into the cold December air as Mr. and Mrs. James Callahan, and Clara felt like a completely new person, like she had shed an old skin and emerged into a life that actually fit her. A small group had gathered outside the church, some genuinely happy for them and others simply curious, and they accepted congratulations and well wishes before climbing into James's wagon for the ride out to the Double R Ranch. The small house that would be their home had been cleaned and prepared by some of the other ranch wives, women Clara did not know well, but who had shown her kindness nonetheless. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table despite the winter season, someone having clearly searched hard to find them, and the wood stove was already burning, filling the space with welcome warmth. James carried her over the threshold, and Clara laughed with pure delight as he set her down gently in what was now their home. They had the afternoon and evening to themselves, Bill having made sure that no one would disturb the newlyweds on their first day of marriage. James had prepared a simple meal, and they ate together at the small table, their knees touching beneath it, their hands clasping between bites. Everything felt new and wonderful and slightly unreal, like Clara was living inside a dream she had never quite dared to dream. After they had eaten and cleaned up, James took both of Clara's hands in his and looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I want this to be perfect for you," he said quietly. "I want everything about this to be something you remember with joy for the rest of your life." Clara reached up and touched his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his lips. "It's already perfect," she whispered, "because I'm with you." They came together slowly, gently, taking their time to explore and discover each other in ways they had not allowed themselves during their courtship. James was patient and attentive, making sure Clara felt cherished and desired, and when they finally joined together as husband and wife, it was with a rightness that brought tears to both their eyes. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, skin against skin, hearts beating in synchrony, and Clara thought that she had never known it was possible to feel so complete, so thoroughly connected to another human being. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, her head resting on James's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. "I love you too," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after that for as long as I live." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, warm and safe and happier than either had ever imagined possible. The winter months that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Clara learned the rhythms of ranch life, learned to manage a household on limited means, learned to cook for a man who worked hard physical labor all day and came home with an appetite to match. James learned about Clara's moods and habits, learned when she needed space and when she needed to be held, learned that she was fiercely intelligent and had opinions about everything from politics to philosophy. They had their disagreements, of course, small conflicts about money or how to spend their limited free time, but they always talked through them, always found compromises that left both feeling heard and valued. James had a temper that flared hot and quick but burned out just as fast, while Clara tended to brood and withdraw when upset. They learned to navigate each other's patterns, to give and take and bend without breaking. The other ranch hands and their families accepted Clara quickly once they saw how happy she made James. She became friends with several of the other wives, women who taught her the practical skills of frontier living that her life in town had not required. She learned to shoot, much to James's surprise and delight, proving to have a natural eye for targets. She learned to help with the horses when needed, discovering that she had her husband's gift for understanding the animals and earning their trust. Spring came slowly to Wyoming, the snow retreating reluctantly to reveal brown earth that gradually turned green with new growth. Clara discovered that she loved the ranch, loved the wide-open spaces and the endless sky, loved the sense of purpose that came from working hard alongside her husband. She also discovered, with a mixture of joy and terror, that she was pregnant. She told James on an evening in early April, when they were sitting together on the small porch of their house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He had been talking about his day, about a particularly stubborn horse he was training, and she had let his words wash over her while she gathered her courage. "James," she said when he paused for breath, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, immediately picking up on the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm pregnant," she said simply, and she watched as the words registered, as his expression shifted from concern to shock to absolute elation. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure," Clara confirmed. "I've missed 2 monthly courses and I've been feeling sick in the mornings. I think the baby will come sometime in late October or early November." James let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral. And then he was pulling Clara into his arms, holding her so tightly she had to protest that he was squeezing the breath out of her. He loosened his grip but did not let go, and she felt him trembling against her with the force of his emotions. "We're going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Clara, we're going to have a baby." "We are," she agreed, and she felt her own tears starting to fall, happy tears this time, tears of joy and anticipation and a little fear of the unknown. "I'm going to be a father," James said, and then he pulled back to look at her, his hands coming up to cup her face. "And you're going to be a mother. God, Clara, you're going to be such an amazing mother." They spent the evening making plans, talking about names and what they would need to prepare, about how their lives were about to change in ways both wonderful and terrifying. James was adamant that Clara should take things easy, should not overexert herself, and she had to laugh at his sudden overprotectiveness. She assured him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, that pregnancy was not an illness, but she could see how much he cared, and she loved him even more for it. The months of her pregnancy passed with a slowness that felt almost cruel. Clara felt sick for the first few months, could barely keep food down, and James hovered anxiously, trying everything he could think of to make her more comfortable. When the sickness finally passed and her appetite returned with a vengeance, he made sure she always had plenty to eat, bringing her treats from town whenever he had reason to go in for supplies. As her belly grew, Clara felt a mixture of awe and discomfort. It was strange to feel another life moving inside her, stranger still to watch her body change in ways she had no control over. James seemed fascinated by every aspect of her pregnancy, would spend hours with his hand on her stomach feeling the baby kick, would talk to the child through her skin and tell elaborate stories about the life they would have together. In late October, Clara went into labor on a cool morning when frost silvered the grass and her breath puffed white in the air. The pains started slowly, easy to ignore at first, but by midday, they had intensified enough that James rode hard for town to fetch the doctor and the midwife. Clara labored through the afternoon and into the evening, and there were moments when she was certain she could not continue, when the pain was so intense she wanted to give up entirely. But James was there with her the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, telling her over and over how strong she was, how proud he was of her, how much he loved her. When their son finally entered the world just after midnight, his angry wails filling the small house with sound and life, Clara felt a love so fierce and overwhelming she could barely breathe with the force of it. The midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Clara's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature who was half her and half James, and she felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "He's perfect," James breathed, leaning over to look at his son with wonder written across every feature. "Clara, he's absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas, after Clara's late husband, because she wanted to honor the man who had given her shelter when she needed it most, and James agreed without hesitation that it was the right choice. Little Thomas had his father's dark hair and his mother's nose, and from his first days of life, he proved to have a strong will and a set of lungs that could wake the entire ranch when he decided he needed something. The early months of parenthood were exhausting in ways Clara had not anticipated. She was constantly tired, constantly worried that she was doing something wrong, constantly overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping another human being alive and healthy. But James was a devoted father, taking over whenever he could, walking the floor with Thomas when he would not sleep, changing diapers without complaint, making sure Clara got at least a few hours of rest each night. As Thomas grew from newborn to infant to toddler, Clara watched in amazement as he developed his own personality. He was curious and fearless, always getting into things he should not, always pushing boundaries to see what he could get away with. He had James's smile and Clara's determination, and he wrapped both his parents around his tiny fingers without even trying. When Thomas was 2 years old, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and on a warm day in June of 1884, she gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth after James's mother. Elizabeth was different from her brother in almost every way, a quiet, thoughtful baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the world around her with solemn gray eyes. Life on the ranch continued, seasons turning into years, and Clara and James built a life together that was richer and fuller than either had dreamed possible. James continued to save money, working longer hours and taking on extra responsibilities. And in the spring of 1886, he finally had enough to make an offer on a parcel of land adjacent to the Double R. The owner was an elderly rancher with no children, and he was willing to sell at a fair price to a young man he respected. The day they signed the papers making them landowners was one of the proudest of James's life. He came home and swept Clara into his arms, spinning her around while Thomas and Elizabeth laughed and danced around their legs, and Clara felt tears of happiness streaming down her face. They were building something together, something real and lasting, a legacy they could pass down to their children. They spent the next several months planning and preparing, deciding where to build their house, where to set up the barn and corrals, how to best utilize the land they now owned. James continued working at the Double R while spending every spare moment on their own property, and Clara helped as much as she could while managing their growing children. Thomas was 4 now, already showing an interest in horses and ranching like his father, while Elizabeth at 2 was proving to be as horse-crazy as her mother, fearless around even the largest animals. By the fall of 1886, they had managed to build a modest but sturdy house on their land. Nothing fancy, but theirs in a way the small cabin on the Double R had never quite been. They had a barn for horses, a small herd of cattle that James had purchased with a loan from Bill Henderson, and plans to slowly expand their operation over the coming years. Moving into their new home felt like a culmination of everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed about during those early days when they barely knew each other, but somehow knew they belonged together. Clara stood in the doorway of their bedroom and looked around at the space they had created, at the furniture James had built with his own hands, at the curtains she had sewn from fabric bought in town, and she felt a contentment so deep, it was almost physical. That night, after the children were asleep in their own small room and the house was quiet, James and Clara lay together in their new bed and talked about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You remember the harvest festival?" James asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Clara's arm. "When I first saw you dancing alone." "Of course I remember," Clara said. "That was the night my life changed. That was the night I realized I didn't have to keep living in the shadows, being the sad widow everyone pitied. That was the night I started to feel alive again." "I was so nervous approaching you," James admitted. "You looked so beautiful, so lost in the music, and I thought to myself that you were probably the most fascinating woman I'd ever seen. But I also thought you'd probably tell me to leave you alone, that I was being too forward." "I almost did," Clara confessed. "I was so scared, James, scared of feeling something, scared of letting myself want something more than the safe, small life I'd resigned myself to. But something about you made me brave, something about the way you looked at me like I was worth taking a chance on." "You were worth it," James said firmly. "You are worth it. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, it was all worth it to get here, to have this life with you." Clara turned in his arms so she could see his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. Even after 5 years together, looking at him still made her heart race, still made her feel that flutter of excitement and desire that had struck her the first time their eyes met. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them by Willow Creek all those years ago. "I love you more than I ever knew it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," James replied, and he kissed her slowly, thoroughly, in the way that still made her toes curl and her breath catch. "I'm going to love you until the day I die, Clara Callahan, and probably for a long time after that." They made love slowly and tenderly, celebrating their new home and their life together, and afterward, Clara lay with her head on James's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart and thought about how lucky she was. She thought about the girl she had been, dancing alone at a harvest festival and thinking her chances for real happiness had passed her by. She thought about the leap of faith she had taken when she put her hand in James's that first night, trusting a stranger with her heart when she had every reason to protect it behind walls of grief and caution. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. They had another child in 1888, a son they named William, who had his mother's auburn hair and his father's easy temperament. The ranch slowly grew and prospered, not making them wealthy but providing enough for them to live comfortably and even save a little for the future. Thomas grew into a lanky boy who could ride almost as well as his father. Elizabeth proved to have her mother's way with words and loved to read every book she could get her hands on, and little William followed his older siblings everywhere with determined persistence. There were hard times too. A particularly brutal winter in 1889 killed several head of cattle and nearly bankrupted them, but they held on through determination and help from Bill Henderson and some of the other ranchers in the area. Clara's neighbor and friend Mrs. Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Clara mourned the loss of the woman who had encouraged her to reach for happiness when everyone else had counseled propriety and restraint. But through everything, through the good times and the struggles, Clara and James had each other. They never lost the passion that had drawn them together. never fell into the trap of taking each other for granted or letting the daily grind of life extinguish the spark between them. They still danced together whenever there was music, still stole kisses when the children were not looking, still talked late into the night about their dreams and fears and everything in between. In 1892, when Clara was 35 and James was 38, they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary. The children were old enough now to be left with a neighboring family for a night, and James surprised Clara by taking her back to Sweetwater for the Harvest Festival, their first time attending since that fateful night when they had met. The town had changed over the decade, grown larger and more prosperous, but the festival was much the same as Clara remembered. There were lanterns strung between the trees, fiddles playing lively tunes, the smell of roasting meat and fresh-baked pies on the air. But this time Clara was not alone, was not the object of pity or whispered gossip. She was a married woman with 3 children and a successful ranch, a woman who had built a good life through love and hard work. When the music started, James led her onto the dance floor just as he had that first night, and they moved together with the ease of long practice and deep familiarity. Clara looked up at her husband, at the lines that had formed around his eyes from squinting into the sun, at the gray that was just starting to appear at his temples, and she loved him even more than she had that first night when he had been a handsome stranger offering his hand. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, smiling down at her. "I'm thinking about how that first dance changed my entire life," Clara said honestly. "I'm thinking about how brave we both were, taking a chance on each other when we barely knew each other. I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you saw me dancing alone and decided to offer me your hand." "Best decision I ever made," James said, pulling her closer. "Dancing with you that night, every dance after, every day of our life together. Best decision I ever made, and I'd make it again in a heartbeat." They danced through song after song, and other couples watched them with smiles, recognizing true love when they saw it. Young women looked at Clara and James and hoped they would find that same kind of partnership, that same obvious devotion. Young men watched and learned what it looked like to truly love a woman, to cherish her not just in the early days of courtship, but through all the years that followed. When they finally left the festival and rode back to their ranch under a sky full of stars, Clara felt a peace and contentment that went soul deep. She had everything she had ever wanted, and many things she had not even known to dream about. She had a husband who loved her completely, who saw all of her, including the messy, complicated parts, and chose her every single day. She had children who were healthy and happy and growing into fine people. She had a home that was truly hers, built by her own hands and those of the man she loved. As they lay in bed that night, James's arms wrapped around her from behind, Clara thought about the woman she had been 10 years ago, hollow-eyed and draped in black, convinced her life was over before it had really begun. She thought about how close she had come to never taking that chance, never accepting James's offered hand, never allowing herself to hope for something more. And she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force in the universe had given her the courage to say yes, to dance, to love, to live. The years rolled on, bringing changes and challenges, but also deep joy. Thomas grew into a fine young man who helped his father run the ranch, who had inherited James's skill with horses and Clara's head for business. Elizabeth became a teacher in Sweetwater, fulfilling the dream Clara had once had of bringing education to the community. William, always the adventurer, talked about going west to California to seek his fortune, though Clara secretly hoped he would change his mind and stay closer to home. In 1898, Clara and James became grandparents when Thomas married a sweet girl named Sarah, and they had a baby boy they named James after his grandfather. Holding her grandson for the first time, feeling the weight of him in her arms, and seeing Thomas's face shine with the same love and wonder she remembered from when her own children were born, Clara felt the circle of life complete itself in the most beautiful way. She was 41 now, her auburn hair streaked with silver, her face lined from years of sun and wind and laughter. James was 44, still strong and capable but moving a little slower than he once had, his dark hair more gray than black now. They had been married for 16 years, together for nearly 17, and Clara loved him more with each passing day. They took to sitting on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over their land, talking about their day and their children and their plans for the future. Sometimes they would dance together under the stars, just the two of them with no music but the wind in the grass and the distant howl of coyotes. Those moments were precious to Clara, reminders of how they had started, of that first dance that had set everything else in motion. In the spring of 1900, as the new century dawned full of promise and possibility, Clara realized she was pregnant again. At 43, she had thought her childbearing years were behind her, and the discovery filled her with both joy and a certain amount of trepidation. She was older now, and pregnancies at her age carried more risk, but when she told James, his face lit up with the same wonder and excitement he had shown with their first child nearly 16 years earlier. "Another baby," he said, his hand going immediately to her still flat stomach. "Clara, another baby, I can't believe it." "Neither can I," she admitted. "I'm a little scared, James. I'm not a young woman anymore." "You're going to be fine," James said firmly, though she could see the worry in his eyes. "We'll take extra care, make sure you don't overdo it. And we have Thomas and Elizabeth and William to help. You're going to be fine, and we're going to have another beautiful baby to add to our family." The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, as Clara had feared. She was tired all the time, her body aching in ways it had not with the other children. But she was also determined, and she took care of herself as best she could, resting when James insisted, eating well, preparing herself mentally and physically for what was to come. In November of 1900, Clara gave birth to twin girls they named Rose and Lily. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when even the doctor looked worried, but Clara was strong and stubborn, and she was not about to leave James and her children after all they had built together. When both babies finally arrived, tiny and perfect, Clara looked at them through exhausted tears and knew that every moment of pain had been worth it. James held his daughters with a gentleness that made Clara's heart ache with love, and their older children crowded around to meet their new sisters with excitement and wonder. Thomas brought Sarah and baby James to meet the twins, and Elizabeth and William cooed over them like they were the most precious things in the world. 5 children, James said later that night as they lay together with the twins sleeping in a cradle beside the bed. "We have 5 children, Clara. 5 beautiful, healthy children, and every single one of them is a miracle." "We're blessed," Clara agreed, her hand finding his in the darkness. "More blessed than I ever imagined possible." The twins grew and thrived, adding even more chaos and joy to the already busy household. Rose was bold and adventurous, always getting into mischief, while Lily was quieter and more thoughtful, content to sit and observe the world around her. As they grew from babies to toddlers to little girls, Clara watched them with a bittersweet awareness that this was likely her last experience of the early years of childhood, that after the twins there would be no more babies. But there would be more grandchildren, she knew. Thomas and Sarah had given them 2 more grandsons in quick succession, and Elizabeth had married a young man from town and was expecting her first child. The family was growing and expanding in ways that filled Clara with pride and joy. In 1905, when Clara was 48 and James was 51, they celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary. Their ranch had prospered beyond their early dreams, large enough now that Thomas had taken over much of the day-to-day management while James focused on training horses, the work he loved best. They had built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, with enough room for everyone to gather for Sunday dinners that were loud and chaotic and absolutely wonderful. That evening, after the celebration with family had ended and the house was quiet, James and Clara walked hand in hand to the spot where their original small house had stood. It was gone now, replaced by a barn, but they both remembered it with fondness as the place where their life together had truly begun. "Do you ever think about that night at the Harvest Festival?" Clara asked, leaning against James's shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't asked me to dance?" "All the time," James admitted. "And it terrifies me, thinking about how close I came to not approaching you, to convincing myself you were out of my league or that you would say no. If I had let fear stop me, I would have missed out on the best thing that ever happened to me." "I think about it too," Clara said. "I think about how I almost said no, how I almost let propriety and fear keep me trapped in a life that didn't fit me. I think about how dancing with you that night saved me in ways I didn't even know I needed saving." "We saved each other," James said, tilting her face up so he could look into her eyes. "You saved me from a life of loneliness and regret, from never knowing what real love felt like. And I'd like to think I saved you from a life of grief and isolation, from never getting to be the vibrant, passionate, amazing woman you were always meant to be." Clara kissed him then, long and sweet, pouring into it all the love and gratitude and devotion she felt. After 22 years, his kisses still made her heart race, still made her feel like the young woman who had danced under the stars and dared to hope for something more. "Dance with me," she said, stepping back and holding out her hand in an echo of that first night. James smiled that slow, transformative smile that she loved so much, and he took her hand and pulled her close. They danced together under the stars with no music but the memory of that first fiddle song, moving together with the practiced ease of decades of partnership. They danced on the land they had built together, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created, and Clara thought that if she died right then, she would die perfectly happy. But she did not die. She lived on, watching her children grow and her grandchildren multiply, watching the ranch continue to prosper, watching the world change around them as the new century brought automobiles and telephones and other marvels she could never have imagined in her youth. Through it all, James was by her side, growing older with her, his love as steady and sure as the sunrise. In 1911, they celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary, and their children threw them a large party at the ranch with friends and family coming from all over Wyoming to celebrate. Clara looked around at the crowd of people, at her 5 children and their spouses, at her 10 grandchildren ranging from infants to teenagers, at the friends they had made over nearly 3 decades of building their life together, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Thomas stood and gave a toast, his voice strong and clear. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. "To 2 people who showed all of us what real love looks like, what partnership means, what it takes to build something lasting and good. You've been an example to us all, and we're grateful beyond words for everything you've given us." Everyone drank, and Clara felt tears streaming down her face, happy tears that James gently wiped away with his thumbs. They cut into a large cake that Elizabeth had made, and they danced together while the children and grandchildren watched and clapped, and Clara felt like the luckiest woman who had ever lived. As the years continued to pass, Clara and James settled into the rhythms of their later life. They worked less on the ranch now, Thomas and his sons handling most of the daily operations, and they spent more time simply enjoying each other's company. They would take long rides across their land, remembering the early days when it had been nothing but potential and hard work. They would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, holding hands and talking or sitting in comfortable silence. The twins grew into beautiful young women, and in 1918 they both married in a double wedding that was the social event of the season in Sweetwater. Rose married a cowboy much like her father, while Lily married a schoolteacher who shared her love of books and learning. Clara watched her youngest daughters start their own lives, and she felt the bittersweet ache of knowing that her role as mother to children who needed her was essentially over. But she was grandmother to so many now, and great-grandmother to a growing number, and there was joy in that as well. In 1921, Clara and James celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. Clara was 64 now, her hair completely silver, her body marked by decades of hard work and childbearing, but still strong and capable. James was 67, his movements slower than they once were, but his mind still sharp and his love for her still burning bright. They did not have a big party this time, just a quiet dinner with their immediate family, and afterward, James asked Clara to walk with him. They went to the barn where he kept his favorite horses, and he led out 2 gentle mares already saddled and ready. One more ride. He asked, and Clara laughed and agreed. They rode out across their land as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Clara looked at the landscape that had been the backdrop of her entire adult life, the land she and James had worked so hard to make productive and beautiful, and she felt such peace and contentment that it was almost overwhelming. They stopped at the top of a hill that overlooked the ranch buildings, the house where they had raised their children, the barns and corrals that held the horses James loved so much. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from Thomas's house, could see tiny figures moving around that were probably some of her grandchildren playing. "We did all right, didn't we?" James said, his hand finding hers where they both rested on their saddle horns. "We did better than all right," Clara replied. "We built something beautiful, James. We built a life worth living, a family worth being part of, a legacy that will outlast us both." "I couldn't have done it without you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Clara. From that first dance to this very moment, you've been my partner, my love, my best friend. I wouldn't trade a single day of our life together, not even the hard ones, because they were all days I got to spend with you." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "I love you," she said, the words as true and vital as they had ever been. "I have loved you from the moment you offered me your hand at that harvest festival, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." They sat together on their horses on top of that hill, watching the sun set on another day, another year, another chapter of the life they had built together. And as darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, Clara thought about the dance that had started it all, about the courage it had taken to say yes to a stranger's invitation, about the leap of faith that had led to everything she held dear. The years that followed were gentle ones. Clara and James grew older together, their steps slower but their love undiminished. They spent their days in quiet contentment, surrounded by the family they had created, secure in the knowledge that they had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and meaning. In the fall of 1925, at the age of 68, Clara began to feel unwell. The doctor diagnosed her with a weakness of the heart, and though he said there was nothing to be done, Clara felt no fear. She had lived a long, wonderful life, had experienced more love and joy than most people even dared dream about, and she was ready for whatever came next. James refused to leave her side during those last weeks. He moved a chair next to their bed and sat with her through the days and nights, holding her hand, telling her stories of their life together, reminding her of all the beautiful moments they had shared. Their children came to visit, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and Clara got to say goodbye to each of them, got to tell them how much she loved them and how proud she was of the people they had become. On a cool October evening, with James holding her hand and their children gathered around the bed, Clara took her last breath. It was peaceful, painless, and she went with a smile on her face and James's name on her lips. James wept as he had not wept since his mother's death so many decades ago, but there was gratitude mixed with his grief, because he had been blessed with 37 years of marriage to the love of his life, and that was more than most people ever got. They buried Clara in a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, and James made sure her headstone read, "Clara Callahan, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. She danced through life with grace and courage, and she was loved beyond measure." James lived for another 3 years after Clara's death, staying on the ranch with Thomas and his family, spending his days with his children and grandchildren, keeping his wife's memory alive through the stories he told. He never remarried, never even considered it, because how could he when he had already found and lost the love of his life? In the spring of 1928, at the age of 71, James passed away peacefully in his sleep. They buried him next to Clara, and the family made sure his headstone complemented hers. James Callahan, beloved husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, he lived with honor and loved with his whole heart. The ranch continued on through the generations, Thomas passing it to his sons, who passed it to their children in turn. The story of James and Clara became family legend, the tale of the cowboy who watched a widow dance alone at a harvest festival and offered his hand for every dance, of the love that had bloomed between them and sustained them through nearly 4 decades of marriage. Future generations would stand at their graves and hear the story, and hope that they might be lucky enough to find even a fraction of what James and Clara had shared. The house they had built still stood well into the next century, modernized and expanded but retaining the bones of what James had constructed with his own hands. The barn where he had kept his beloved horses was still in use, and the land they had worked so hard to make productive continued to support the family they had started. Their legacy lived on not just in property and possessions, but in the values they had instilled in their children, the love they had modeled, the courage they had shown in taking a chance on each other when the world said it was too soon, too fast, too risky. And sometimes, on cool autumn evenings when the harvest moon hung low and golden over the Wyoming landscape, people swore they could see 2 figures dancing together on the hill where James and Clara were buried, moving in perfect synchrony to music only they could hear, locked in an embrace that death itself could not break. Whether it was truth or fancy, no one could say for certain, but it was a beautiful story, and it spoke to the enduring power of a love that had started with a simple dance and grown into something eternal. The tale of the cowboy and the widow who danced at the harvest festival became more than just family history. It became a story that was told throughout Sweetwater and the surrounding ranches, a reminder that love could be found in unexpected places and unexpected times, that it was never too late to take a chance on happiness, that sometimes the greatest adventures in life began with a single step, a single dance, a single moment of courage. Young women in town would hear the story and dream of finding a love like Clara had found, a love that transformed and sustained and endured. Young men would hear it and aspire to be like James, to see beyond surface appearances to the spirit within, to offer their hands in partnership and support and unwavering devotion. The story became a touchstone, a reminder of what was possible when 2 people chose each other and kept choosing each other through all the years and challenges that followed. And so the legacy of that first dance lived on, generation after generation, a testament to the power of love and courage and the willingness to say yes when the universe offers you something precious and rare. James and Clara Callahan had built more than just a successful ranch or a large family. They had built a love story for the ages, one that would be remembered and cherished long after the last of their descendants had passed from the earth. They had proven that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with the simplest gestures, and that a hand offered in invitation can change not just one life or 2, but countless lives across countless years. Their story was complete, their circle closed, their love immortalized not just in stone markers on a windswept hill, but in the hearts and memories of everyone who had known them and everyone who would hear their tale in the years to come. From that first dance under the lantern-lit sky to their final rest side by side overlooking the land they had loved, James and Clara had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would never be forgotten.